Hi, everyone.
Hello there. We're in Revelation chapter 2 now. We've done a bit of chapter 3, the Church of Sardis, and it needs to be said at the beginning, we ended the last one on Sardis with the suggestion that if you were in the age of locomotion that we're in, if you're disappointed with your church, as many must have been in the Church of Sardis, the ones who were trying to be loyal in the midst of a disloyal or a compromised environment, might have contemplated moving. But where would you move to? Well, how about the Church of Ephesus? And we're going to be reading from our document, which, by the way, is on screen. So if we're looking off to your right, it's because the document we're reading from is on the screen over there. This is where we ended off last time. Why not pack up the family and move into a really solid Orthodox Christian community, the church in Ephesus? If any church in the first century deserved the title superchurch, surely it was Ephesus. Founded by one apostle, Paul himself, ministered to by Paul's personal pastoral pick, Timothy, now led by the apostle John, and first among the 7 destinations of John's pastoral letter, the book of Revelation. Already 2 generations of solid, orthodox, safe Christian teaching. Surely Ephesus is the place to be for a serious Christian and his family. So we wanted to read the 7 verses of chapter 2 on Ephesus from the New World Translation.
Okay. To the angel of the congregation in Ephesus, write, these are the things that he says who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, he who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. I know your deeds and your labor and endurance, and that you cannot bear bad men, and that you put those to the test who say they are apostles, but they are not, and you found them liars. You are also showing endurance, and you have borne up for my name's sake, and have not grown weary. Nevertheless, I hold this against you, that you have left the love you had at first. Therefore, remember from what you have fallen, and repent, and do the former deeds. If you do not, I am coming to you, and I will remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent. Still you do have this, that you hate the deeds of the sect of Nicolaus, which I also hate. Let the one who has an ear hear what the Spirit says to the congregations. To him that conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God.
There's lots to commend this church. First of all, in verse 2, Christ says to the church, I know your works, your toil and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. That's the ESV version. So obviously, the early apostolic training, Paul, Timothy, and then John himself, has left them in a very good place when it comes to doctrinal soundness. They are testing the false claims of those who pretend to be teachers up there with the apostles.
So it kind of reminds you of Acts chapter 2, where it says that that was one of the things that the early church did, was be devoted to the teachings of the apostles. So they're keeping that up. They're testing what other new apostles coming up are saying, so that they can identify whether or not they're matching up with the apostles, the original apostles.
So there's no problem with them on that count. They are resisting the heretical tendencies of false teachers. So there's another blow at the idea that there was an apostasy that took place, took root, even while the apostles were alive. There were also false teachers, it's true, but there were also true teachers who were holding to the apostolic truths. And I thought, I was particularly struck by what it says in verse 3 about their endurance and bearing up was for which name?
My name's sake. And it's Jesus that's talking to them. So the my is Jesus. So that, yeah, it goes kind of contrary to what we would have thought as witnesses.
So the loyalty of the church is to Jesus Christ, and the culture knew it. That's the name they associated with the early disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't repent, though, because he does say they have a big problem, they've abandoned the love they had at first. So you could say the honeymoon was over, but he gives them the chance to repent. This is not a fatal problem necessarily. Love can ebb and flow.
So how many generations after the first church is this?
So this would be the third generation.
So I think this is something you do see within, just in normal life. You see when someone becomes a believer, they're usually really hot. They're really, really strong about their faith, and then they have a family. And the second generation, may be raised to have a real love for God and the Bible and truth. And then the third generation, you find as the generations go on, there's a slight dip down, and then another dip up, like another climb up. So this constant flow happens within the church.
In the history of sociology, social history, you see that pattern over and over. There's revival, and then 3 generations later you need another revival.
Yeah.
It appears this is the case here. But again, it's not, well, if you don't like what's going on, move on. It's, I will judge. I will come, he says.
He is the judge, not you or anyone else.
How long did it take for this lampstand to be moved, if it had to be moved? And that's a question we'll take up next time. But Christ is the one who will judge this church, not us.
And then I think it gives you the indication that there will always be individuals that are faithful. Because when he talks, he says, let the one who has an ear hear what the Spirit says. And it's the Spirit saying. So that makes it personal. But also, he also says, where is it?
To the one who conquers.
To him that conquers. So it's very individual. There will be people who will conquer and people who don't.
In every church.
Within the church, yeah.
He mentions the Nicolaitans. Commentators are still puzzling over who exactly this group is. They're obviously a major problem here. But the very fact that the Nicolaitans, there's so little information about them today, shows that in effect the early church was successful in resisting this particular heresy. So that it's disappeared from even history. And then finally this reference to the paradise of God. Now where is that paradise? If you're a Jehovah's Witness, you have to make a concession here and say, well, there is a paradise in heaven, but of course the paradise you're concerned with is in the future 1,000-year period. But that's not the case here.
So it's good to know what they would have thought back then. And in the studies we've done, the rabbis taught that when man rebelled, the paradise was taken up, right, to heaven.
When God disappeared, so did the paradise. So the paradise now is the paradise of God in heaven, which would one day return, but only when new heavens and new earth have been inaugurated. So that's not during the millennium, but after the millennium, according to Revelation 22, where you have the tree of life seen again.
Yeah, isn't there a second reference that it could be, in that they talked about within Hades there were levels, and one could have been called the paradise of God, the bosom position of Abraham. To be in that position was to be in heaven.
There was disagreement as to what this paradise in Hades was, but that's one version of it. The other one is that paradise was taken back to heaven, and God is there now, and the saints are there that die until the day when they will return with Christ and get their bodies back.
Right.
So here's the situation in Ephesus. The church is doctrinally sound but hardening into lovelessness. Yeah, not everything in Ephesus was ideal for the Christian family. If any place in the world offered a safe space to the patriarchal religions of Judaism and Christianity, Ephesus was definitely not that place. If there was a religious center in the ancient world that deserved the title Mecca of the sacred feminine, it was Ephesus. Now this is what William Barclay has to say about the situation in Ephesus in those days. Barclay says the third temple, the temple which was standing in the time of John, was one of the 7 wonders of the world. The Greek saying ran, "The sun sees nothing finer in his course than Diana's temple." It was the pride of Ephesus. When it was being built, women gladly offered their jewels and their ornaments that it might be beautified. Alexander the Great had offered all the magnificent spoils of his eastern campaigns, if only his name might be inscribed upon it. But his offer was refused, for none but the name of Ephesus might be connected with the temple of Diana. To millions, this strange image of Diana/Artemis was the most sacred thing in the world. Behind the image there was a still inner shrine. To it people came to deposit their valuables for safekeeping. The temple of Diana was in fact the Bank of England of the ancient world. In a world of wars and civil wars, a temple was always a safe deposit, for seldom would a temple be violated, and the temple of Diana was the safest of all.
And that's the end of Barclay, right?
Yeah.
Therefore, by the 3rd generation, Christianity had time to adjust to the reality of Ephesus. Not only the chief politically correct option, the pre-patriarchal worship of the nature goddess, but the safest economic bet for someone dwelling in the Roman province of Asia, the Bank of Ephesus. Knowing the temptations even Orthodox believers faced in such a city, we can perhaps better understand what had happened by the end of the 1st century. And then you have a quote from Stott. Stott says, "They had fallen from the early heights of their devotion and had descended to the plains of mediocrity. In a word, they were backsliders."
So there were lots of good reasons to be in Ephesus if you were a Christian, but there were also a lot of temptations, a lot of pressures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm reminded that those famous sayings, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, about being no part of the world, in the Gospel of John, they are no part of the world, even as I am no part of the world, etc. And then in 1 John, the love of the world is not something that Christians should have.
Mm-hmm.
Because the world is passing away in its desire, but he that does the will of God remains forever. So those are in John documents. In other words, when John thinks of the world, he's thinking of Ephesus.
Mm.
And therefore the get out of the world is not physically get out of the world. And this also goes back to what we said last time about get out of Babylon. You can't physically get out of the Roman Empire. You can't physically get out of Ephesus if you're there.
Yeah.
But you can be no part of Ephesus and no part of the world.
There's a need to be aware of the temptations that you're facing. You know, too often we just sort of go along with what we see happening in the world. So that kind of reminded me of Gorman's book on reading Revelation responsibly. He says every generation of Christian has to be conscious of being countercultural.
Mm.
And not just assimilating with what society is up to. Any given society has its tendencies in the wrong direction. So we have to kind of be conscious of that and resist
Swimming.
just following in and following the stream.
Not going with the flow, but swimming against the tide. Yeah. So next time we're going to take up more about what the commentators have to say about the situation in Ephesus and answer the question, did this church in Ephesus repent? And how long was it until Christ actually had to move the lampstand? Because here it's a threat. Mm-hmm. But when you know the history of Ephesus, you realize, well, Christ didn't have to move that lampstand for a very long time.
So we'll put some links in as well.
And the links are to...
One was the Divine Name series that you had. The last one is about Paul in Ephesus.
Paul brings God the Father to a city where God is the Mother. Yeah.
And then Gorman on resisting the world. We
Michael
have
Gorman.
a video on that.
How Christians resisted the world in the 1st century.
Mm-hmm.
In the book Revelation, Reading Revelation Responsibly is the title, right?
Yes, excellent book.
Next time.
Mm-hmm.